Let's go ahead and get started with November. Obviously, a lot happened in October. We found a ton out about all of our characters, including just how much Miss Baker either likes or doesn't like him. So as we move in November, that's going to really start to get clear as Holling and Mrs. Baker start working through Shakespeare. Obviously, they've already read one book called Merchant of Venice, and now they're going to be moving into something else. Let's go ahead and get started so that we can maybe get done with, we'll come close to finishing 2 chapters this week. So we'll get into maybe almost 1968, but we're still in 1967, November. Here we go. November dripped into Long Island as it did every year. The days turned gray and damp, and a hovering mist licked everything. Personification. The perfect, oh no, white cement sidewalk in front of the perfect house was always wet. The azaleas lost the remnants of their white and pink blossoms, and then many of their leaves, and since they were half naked and embarrassed, my father wrapped them in a tight burlap, which also got wet. Personification. On the first Saturday, I cut the lawn for the last time, and then my father cut the lawn again to get it right, since it was going to look this way until spring, he said, and it had better look good. The next Saturday, we climbed up to the roof and cleaned out the gutters, since they were overflowing now every time it rained, and the dirty water was staining the corners of the perfect house, which made my father really mad. So you can see that Dad is on this quest for everything to be perfect, and he doesn't trust Holling at all to do it. So he ends up doing everything himself to make it perfect, but nothing ever seems to stay perfect there, does it? Very controlling Dad. But not as mad as the stain on the ceiling of the perfect living room made him. No one knew how long water had been dripping down onto it because no one ever went in there. So by the time my mother discovered it while vacuuming, the stain was as wide as a garbage can lid and dark with mold. That's trouble. That night when my father reached up to feel it, a handful of plaster came down on his face. Some of the moldy stuff got into his mouth. It was a very quiet supper. But that's November. It's the kind of month where you're grateful for every single glimpse of the sun or any sign of blue sky above the clouds because you're not sure that they're there anymore. And if you can't have sun or blue sky, then you wish it would snow and cover all the gray world with a sparkling white so bright that your eye can't take it in. But it doesn't snow on Long Island in November. It rains and rains and rains. So there's a symbol, and we haven't talked really much about symbolism, but if you can picture what rain would mean, think about how rain makes you feel, the mood. If it's raining all the time, what do you think this is symbolizing for what's going to happen? And here's where we can maybe make a prediction. We're not there yet, though. Which is how I think Mrs. Baker got the idea of signing me The Tempest, another Shakespeare story. The Tempest is the story in which the real characters of Caliban and Sycorax are in. But her nefarious plot to bore me to death failed again, because The Tempest was even better than The Merchant of Venice. In fact, it almost beat out Treasure Island, which is saying something. It was surprising how much good stuff there was. A storm, attempted murders, witches, wizards, invisible spirits, revolutions, characters drinking until they're dead drunk, and an angry monster named Caliban. Can you believe it? I was amazed that Mrs. Baker was letting me read this. It's got to be censored all over the place. I figured that she hadn't read it herself. Otherwise, she would have never let me read it. Caliban, the monster in the play, not the escaped rat, he knew cuss words. I mean, he really knew cuss words. What Mr. Vendleri said while standing on Danny Huffer's desk didn't come close. Even Doug Switek's brother couldn't cuss like that. And he could cuss the yellow off a school bus. Hyperbole. Also foreshadowing. Remember Doug Switek's brother and school bus for down the road. I decided to learn them all by heart, even if I didn't know exactly what they meant. I didn't know what most of Doug Switek's brothers' cusses meant either, and it didn't make all that much difference. It's all in the delivery anyway. So I practiced in my bedroom thinking of my sister. All right, so here come all of the curses. And remember, these are cuss words, but they're cuss words in Old English, so they're not really. But here we go. A southwest blow on ye and blister ye all over.
A southwest blow on ye and blister you all over.
I know, it doesn't sound like much, but if you say it slow and menacing, especially when you get to blister, it'll do. Keep your eyes half closed and it will really do. But for the rest of the Caliban curses, it's a lot better to say them loud and fast like, the red plague rid you! And toads, beetles, bats light on you!
All the charms of Sycorax, toads, beetles, bats light on you.
And as wicked do as e'er my mother brushed with raven's feather from unwholesome fen drop on you.
As wicked do as e'er my mother brush with raven's feather from unwholesome fen drop on you both.
I'm not exactly sure what that last one means, but if you really hit the last 3 words hard, it'll do its stuff. I told you that Mrs. Baker wouldn't have let me read this if she'd read it herself. Okay, so let's stop right there. I mean, she's read this, clearly. And again, Holling can't believe that she would let him read this with all of these curses. And obviously, she knows about them. And they're not like curses like we are thinking of cuss words in our head. But they are funny. And they are coming back into this story. Every night after supper, I practice in front of the dress mirror without my shirt, because I could look more menacing that way. I decided to perfect the toads, beetles, bats one first, since that was the one I understood the best, and because when I said it, a little bit of spit came out with the beetles. By the second Tuesday night, I had gotten it down and could say toads with a blood-curdling croak when my mother knocked on my bedroom door. Holling, she said, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I called. "Sounds like you're talking to someone." "I'm practicing for a speech," I said, which was sort of true. "Oh," she said. "Oh, then I'll leave you to finish." I worked on the red plague for a bit because that one is all in the timing. Then my father knocked on the door. There must have been a commercial on. "I can hear you all the way down in the den. What are you doing?" So just so we're clear, he's sitting in his room like shouting out all of those curses that I just shouted out. "Practicing Shakespeare," I said. "What do you need Shakespeare for?" "For Mrs. Baker." "For Mrs. Baker?" "Yes." "Then get it right," he said and walked away. I went back to the toad, beetles, bats until my sister knocked on the door. "Holling." "Yeah?" "Shut up! A southwest blow on ye and blister you all over," I said. She threw open the door. "What did you say to me?" In the face of a 16-year-old sister who's about to drop something on you from heaven, even Shakespeare fails. "Nothing," I said. "Keep it that way," she said, "and put your shirt on, you weirdo." She slammed my door shut. I decided I was done with practicing for the night. I went to school early the next day since I needed some private place to practice the curses. When I reached the 3rd floor, I found Mr. Vendleri holding a ladder steady in the middle of the hall. He had half a dozen spring traps in his hand, which he was holding up toward Mr. Guareschi. I could see only Mr. Guareschi's legs, since the rest of him was poked up through an opening where he'd removed some asbestos tiles. "Hand me the rest," Mr. Guareschi called down, and Mr. Vendleri did. "Now the cheese." Mr. Vendleri reached into his bib overalls and pulled out a plastic bag with cubes of yellow cheese. "Now I'll just pull this spring back," Mr. Guareschi said, "and set the bait right beneath." There was a sudden loud snap, and then it wasn't mercy dropping down as the gentle rain on the place beneath. It was Mr. Guareschi. "Oh!" he said. Not really oh, but it wasn't as good as Shakespeare, not even as good as Mrs. Baker. Mr. Guareschi looked up from the floor. His face was red and his fingers redder. What happened? Snap. He shook them wildly as if he wanted them to separate from the rest of him. Oh, he said again. Not really. You could try the red plague rid you, I said. Mr. Qureshi, still on the ground, looked up at me. What are you doing in school so early? He said. Or scurvy patch, I said. Mr. Qureshi shook his fingers again. You're not supposed to be here this early, he said. He saw us putting up the cages, said Mr. Vendleri. Mr. Qureshi stared at him. This is the student who let the rats go, he said. He already knows. Mr. Vendleri looked hard at me, then he put a finger up to his lips. Not a word, he said. Toad, beetles, bats, light on me if I let it out, I said, and I got the timing just right, even a little bit of spit on the beetles. Mr. Qureshi looked at me strangely, and then he slowly stood, picked up the spring traps that had fallen around him, and turned to climb back up the ladder. Considering the condition of his red fingers, I thought it was pretty brave of him. Go to class, Hollinghood, he said. Mrs. Baker was already in her classroom. She was looking up at the ceiling when I came in, listening to the scrambling and pattering of feet scurrying across the asbestos tiles overhead. We listened together for a moment until the scurrying stopped. Not a word, Mr. Hoodhood, she said. Not a word, I said, and went to my desk. Did you finish The Tempest? Asked Mrs. Baker. Yes, I said. We'll see this afternoon, she said, and then she turned back to a pile of essays on her desk, spreading a red plague over them with her pen. It's a metaphor. She's not really spreading a red plague. What's she doing? Even though I didn't have the private place to practice that I wanted, I figured I could work on the Caliban curses to see if I could get them down just right in a pressure situation. So I whispered into my desk, strange stuff, the dropsy drown you, which was cheating a little bit because I put two together, but I thought it sounded right. I tried it again, thinking about Caliban and Sycorax, the rats, not the monsters in the play, because I wanted to make the strange stuff come out more like a hiss. Strange stuff. The dropsy drown you, I whispered. Is there something you have to say? Asked Mrs. Baker. I sat up. No, I said. Are you speaking to someone hiding in your desk? I shook my head. She put her red pen down. Since there are only two of us in the room, a situation which has become very familiar to us these past months, and since you were speaking, I assumed that you must be addressing me. What did you say? Nothing. Mr. Hoodhood, what did you say? Strange stuff. The dropsy drown you. Mrs. Baker considered me for a moment. Was that what you said? Yes. A curious line to recite, especially since the combination never occurs in the play. Are you trying to improve on Shakespeare? Right, so Shakespeare is considered maybe one of the greatest writers of all time. Is Holling trying to improve Shakespeare? I like the rhythm of it, I said. The rhythm of it. Yes. Mrs. Baker considered this for a moment, then she nodded. So do I, she said, and turned back to spreading the red plague. That's interesting. Why do you think she's okay with Holling saying these curses that aren't really curses? It does seem like he understands what they mean. And, you know, you've seen them now yourself. You've heard me say them. And you can see that I know what they mean because I've read this book several times and I've read Shakespeare before. But you're probably sitting there saying to yourself, some of those words make sense, but some of them don't. So think about Holling, who's spending all of this extra time learning Shakespeare. While he sort of thinks he's learning cuss words, he's actually understanding the context of the words. And then he's blending things together, which as a teacher is fantastic. Like, I totally understand why she's sort of okay with it. That had been close. But I watched her with something like amazement. She had known the curses. Both of them. She had read the play. And she had still let me read it. Whatever she was plotting, it was a whole lot more devious than I had given her credit for. I decided to ease into things more naturally, to let Caliban curses come where they might fit in without any fuss. At lunch, I found that my mother had given me a bologna sandwich with no mayonnaise, a stalk of celery that had been wilting since the weekend, and a cookie with something growing on it that wasn't supposed to be there. "Strange stuff," I whispered. At lunch recess, Doug Switek's brother lurched across the field, sixth graders scurrying out of his way as if he was a southwest wind about to blister them all over. "Thou jesting monkey, thou," I said. Not so that he could hear it. Right after recess, I found that the eighth graders had filled the boys' restroom with smoke so thick you couldn't even smell the disinfectant. "Apes with foreheads, villainous low," I said. Not so that they could hear it. In geography, Mr. Petrelli announced a unit project, the Mississippi River and you. I raised my hand and told Mr. Petrelli that I had never been to the Mississippi River and had no plans to go soon. I didn't feel any kind of personal stake in it at all, so I didn't understand the you part. "Must all history center around your personal experience, Hood?" Mr. Petrelli asked. It did seem that since we were talking about the Mississippi River and you, or in this case, me, one possible answer to this question would be yes. But in Camillo Junior High, and especially in Mr. Petrelli's class, the right answer is usually just shutting up. "Your report," Mr. Petrelli continued to the class, "can be on," I whispered the "toad, beetles, bats" one here, and I got it just right. In chorus, Miss Violet of the Very Spiky Heels. The Very Spiky Heels line isn't in Shakespeare. It's from Danny Hupfer. Miss Violet of the Very Spiky Heels figured we had way too many altos, and she told me to move forward to sing the melody with the sopranos. "Me?" I said. "You have a lovely clear voice, Holling." "I can't sing soprano." "Of course you can," said Miss Violet. "Just reach for the high notes." I gave my music, my tenor music, to Danny Hupfer. "You have a lovely clear voice, Holling," he said. "Pie, ninny," I said. Marilee made room for me on her music stand. "You didn't know you could sing like a girl, did you?" she said. "Blind mole, a wicked dew from unwholesome fen drop you," I said. I was getting good at making combinations. Marilee grabbed my arm. "What did you say?" Miss Violet of the Very Spiky Heels tapped her baton for silence. Then she raised her hands and waved them grandly, and we began a medley of American folk songs, which are supposed to make your heart swell patriotically. I tried to look like I cared a whole lot about reaching for the high notes, of which there were more than enough. Marilee still held my arm. "What did you say?" she asked again. "I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger." "That's not what you said," she said. "A-traveling through this world of woe." Marilee moved her hand up toward my throat. Then Mrs. Violet of the Very Spiky Heels tapped her baton again. Everyone went quiet. "Marilee," Miss Violet said. Marilee dropped her hand and looked at Miss Violet. Her cheeks flushed into a color you only see in television cartoons. "Marilee," said Miss Violet, "I didn't send Holling up there so you could flirt with him." Well, the look that came over Marilee's face was the look you'd have if you wanted the earth to open up so that you could jump in and no one would ever see you again forever and ever. Her mouth opened, her eyes opened, and her nostrils opened. Even the freckles across her nose got a whole lot bigger. Ms. Violet tapped the baton again, and we started to sing. And that's where we're going to stop today. And today we are going to do the prediction of our crop QVS. So we have a lot of stuff that just happened there with Marilee. And some of it was hyperbole, that whole last paragraph right there, when the earth was going to open up so you can jump in and no one to see you forever, and her mouth opened, her eyes opened, and her nostrils opened. Even the freckles across her nose got a whole lot bigger. All that's hyperbole. So think about how she's feeling, and then we're going to make a prediction about what's going to happen before tomorrow's reading, okay? And that's going to be our crop QV, which we're going to go to right now. All right, we'll see you guys. Great job today.